Hey guys, welcome back. So now, I was thinking, like, getting into Marauders and going forward into Dawn of X, there's a lot we gotta get caught up with. So a few of these videos are gonna be pretty extensive as far as what we get into. And then here and there, I may cover things that are like in between the lines that are not fully expressed, kind of like we did with Powers of 10 in the whole Sinister Betrayal event, because I really got this feeling that things like that are just gonna pop up later on. So let's get into it. But first, if you're new to the channel, be sure to subscribe to catch the spills every week. And don't forget to hit that bell up top so we can squad up in the comments for the first hour. Alright, so getting into Marauders, like, there are a lot of politics here, and I especially like the bit of animosity that's going on between Sebastian Shaw and Emma Frost, which is something that happened back in House of X when she had taken a seat of power before Sebastian Shaw, and with her knowing that his seat was coming and that seat being mandatory, she had immediately used her leverage to gain more seats into her favor. And to say the least, Shaw, the Black King, doesn't like that, but we'll get deeper into that in just a little bit. But so now, as far as your Marauders team, who are like your get it done crew, to where on this team we have Storm, the original Pyro, St. John Elderies, I think it is, or I think that's how you say it, and then you have Iceman, Kitty, or Kate Pride, Bishop, and then way behind the scenes you have Emma Frost. And so now pretty much their tasks are the hands-on part of what Professor X had mentioned back in House of X, as far as smuggling goods and getting mutants the opportunity to make their way to Krakoa safely from different destinations all over the world, which may not necessarily agree with it. And back then we had talked about how it sounded kind of shady, but at the same time, it's like as we see it go through, it's pretty necessary. But speaking of things going through, and I didn't mean to do Kitty like that, but early on, one of the issues she runs into, I did it again, but one of the issues she runs into is that she can't cross through the door, either to get back to Krakoa or travel elsewhere. And when this happens, it's only her. And so now really, because the series started off this way, it's one of those things that leads into the story, because one, during this time with her worrying like what did she do to piss Krakoa off, it also kind of leads her in this place of where she has to travel by boat or use other conventional or even non-conventional means to either communicate or get around much of these far distances, to where in other cases many others can just skip the ride. But even with doing so, things like traveling by sea is something she's become accustomed to, whether she's doing different stock runs like for Wolverine, who literally sent her out with a shopping list which was mainly like whiskey, beer, ribs, coffee. And it's pretty funny how the booze got popular because a lot of people started digging into his stash not long after. But as far as Kate, who's really at this place right now to where when other people want to walk through the doors they just go, and she's kind of just left there. But even with this happening, she's approached by Emma Frost, and much to her benefit, she's an Omega level telepath, so with this you can just pull Kate into a meeting and save her the trip. And so now this meeting between Emma and Kate, it's not the first, but it's more so like Emma giving her a follow-up so she can get a more solid answer. Because one of the things that Emma's been requesting from Kitty is that she takes a prestigious role within the Hellfire Trading Company, and essentially with doing so she gets a faster ship, more firepower, which will definitely come in handy when running into resistance from certain countries who don't want mutants to transit to Krakoa. And essentially she would be living on the ship, which there is plenty of space for, but also with doing this, it would also provide a separation for her and her team to have what they're doing not be so closely associated with the other X-Men. Because along with the scrimmages, you also have the drugs which are being shipped off book, which are essentially going to the countries like we talked about in House of X that refuse the legalization of Krakoan drugs. So now this way, these deals can still get done, and now the X-Men can trap all over the planet. Because Marauders is low-key like Dawn of the Mutant Trap, like Dawn of the Mutant Trap stars. And for me, like, it's really one of the reasons that, and it's interesting, because this is really one of the reasons they really earned that name Marauders. And not even like to compare it to Sinister's old team, to where the only real similarity at this point is that you have a team of raiders going towards a cause, which back with Sinister was supporting the integrity of his work and research by any means necessary, and now it's preserving the needs of Krakoa by any means necessary. And like even in the meantime, before Kitty Pryde accepted Emma's offer, of which there was two offers, and like the first one was supposed to be kept hush hush, and I mean at this point we're definitely gonna get into both of them by the end of the video. But even with it supposedly supposed to be a secret, I remember you guys were already talking about it like in House of X down in the comments, and mainly because of helpful things like Twitter, because like with social media, like news travels fast. But during the in-between time, while Kitty Pryde was kind of mulling over her decision between both of Emma's offers, it's here where we got one of the examples of one of the scrimmages that these guys would run into. Because when Iceman steps through the doorway to go to Russia, to where the doorway is heavily guarded by like a knockoff water-cooled Iron Man whose suit has the capability to dampen mutant powers, this more or less just leaves Bobby naked and afraid, which in turn caused him to go back to Krakoa and get the rest of the gang to go back with a bit more help on his side. And so when he tells Kitty Pryde and the others, Kitty's pretty much just like, "Arr, me matey, let's go." And it's something that they handle pretty quickly, so we won't spend too much time on it with everything else going on. But one of the things I do want to point out, like especially with Pyro who's back, and Iceman really didn't notice this until Pyro spoke and you heard the old accent, but this is one of those reoccurring things that we'll see especially in Dawn of X, which is essentially X-Men Rebirth. Like, I'm gonna rename this thing like 10 times, so just deal with it. But one of the things that's gonna be very common, much like with St. John Pyro returning here, and with doing so missing some of his memories, which is probably something Xavier had did by choice, but it's also one of those things to where his time of death may have conflicted with the backup schedule like we talked about back in House of X, because if anyone were to die like just before the next backup, then they will be missing weeks or even months of their own memory, which is pretty important because we're gonna see this again not too much later on. But when they arrive in Russia to attack these dudes who are just waiting by the door, which kind of gives them the drop on these guys, but even with doing so, this encounter is just really here to show us a couple things, because one, we have Storm who reiterates, and mainly to Pyro because he's the one who needed to hear it, but she mainly reiterates that as a team under no circumstances are they to take a human life, which essentially is one of your laws from the Quiet Council of Krakoa. But even for this team of raiders traveling the lawless seas, it's very important that they follow the same code, and even with doing so, Kitty kind of pushes it to the limit a bit, like phasing through the guys and leaving the gun there. Like if dude on the right has a leg spasm, the other dude's in trouble. But to say the least, Kitty is super effective, especially towards a tank, because at the end of the day, you can't fight what you can't touch. And I gotta say, like, even seeing Kitty step back into this leadership role and kind of coining the name of the Marauders for this team, with her sending out the message for any mutant who's trying to get to Krakoa, like, don't worry, the Marauders will get you home. It really just reminds me how Kitty Pryde is like one of the perfect leaders out of all the X-Men, and not even to the gravity of being like my favorite leader when you think of others like Wolverine, Cyclops, or Storm. But unlike those other three examples, Kitty Pryde is the least likely to get sidetracked or leave her duties for any other reason once she's fully on board. And I feel like this is something that's going to stick much longer than what we've seen in X-Men Gold, because if you guys remember back when we started to get into X-Men Gold, which was not long after we talked about Kitty Pryde in the 1610 with her and James Hudson Jr. leading the mutants to Utopia, but our X-Men Gold talks, they clearly just branched off into like X-Men Blue and Old Man Logan. But back at the time, in what was very much likely either a James Hudson video or an Old Man Logan video, but at the time we had dabbed a little bit into the relationship between Kitty Pryde and Storm, whose friendship goes back nearly, I want to say, all the way to like Kitty's first appearance. And like once they became close, like getting milkshakes, getting coffee, like it just became a thing. And one of the things to like definitely keep in mind first is like back when Charles first discovered Kitty Pryde, to where at the time soon after her and Storm began to get close, back then even still you also had the interest of Emma Frost, who at the time was heavily involved with the Hellfire Club, who wanted to bring Kitty Pryde to the Massachusetts Academy. And it's one of those conflicts between Storm and Emma Frost which we still see pieces of to this day. But as far as my point with X-Men Gold, it was at that time not long after Inhumans vs. X-Men, when Kitty Pryde had just got back from her tour with the Guardians of the Galaxy. It was then when Storm was stepping down from the X-Men and she wanted Kitty Pryde to take her spot. And eventually Kitty did, and if I remember correctly, like one of her first orders, if you will, she had given Storm the orders to stay instead of being so hard on herself and just leaving. And I wanted to point that out because one, the friendship between Kitty Pryde and Storm, which has evolved from like mentor to like sisters, like it still continues to this day. But also when she has this talk with Storm about getting involved with Emma Frost and the Hellfire Trading Company, Storm lets her know that she's with her, but she wants no parts of Emma Frost, which is likely for the reasoning of their early history back when they both met Kitty Pryde years ago. But so now speaking of Emma Frost, who within the Hellfire Trading Company, which essentially is the spring portion of the Quiet Council, with the 3 seats going to the White Queen, the Black King, and the Red King, of which the seat of the Red King has been empty up to this point. And though we know from House of X when Emma Frost was told to bring in Sebastian Shaw, like even from then she had taken that seat prior to bringing in Shaw. But as it turns out, Shaw has his own plans for that seat, and he's pretty pissed to say the least, not with just Emma Frost making this move of power over him, but also the other moves that she has going around it. Because in addition to this, we find out that she's used the help of Kitty Pryde to take down other smuggling ships that Sebastian Shaw was using, which were already moving drugs to different countries, and I mean like tens of millions of dollars worth. And really it isn't something new to the Hellfire Club, but with the new changes that are being made, Emma Frost pretty much orchestrated this so that the old ships would be taken down, and in their place the Marauders would arrive with only the Krakoan pharmaceuticals. And essentially Emma Frost doing this, it's really like her taking a stronghold over the entire import-export off-book resources of the Hellfire Club and funneling that business to the Marauders, which is essentially like two things in one, because of course on one hand you're taking over one of the biggest international distributors, which would be a big money move if they were two separate entities, but essentially because she's making this move against Sebastian Shaw, who literally sits across the table, is really more of a slap in the face and a punch to the pockets than anything else. And just for the record, like with her literally just throwing away tens of millions of dollars with doing this, Krakoa is not hurting for money, which makes one of us. But also like just thinking about those ships that were supposed to deliver that other stuff, like I can only imagine their client's reaction when the the Marauders pull up and they only got Krakoan pharmaceuticals, because that may very well be the next epic event around the corner. But to make all of this simple, like the main reason for Emma Frost doing this, it's one, to send a message to Sebastian Shaw, who has a history of valuing money over mutant kind, but also because she knew whoever sat in that third seat, it needed to be somebody who sided with her, rather than someone who was neutral and would bounce back and forth, or worst case scenario, someone who would always side with Sebastian Shaw. So essentially, with Emma Frost making these moves, because Charles needed her first, she of course took first dibs and modeled the new structure in her favor. But of course, with bringing in Shaw, which she didn't want to do, it at least set her up in the position, because she was needed first, to establish her power and get the majority seats for the Hellfire Club, which of course, as many of you know, the third seat she had given to Kitty Pryde, who really from this point forward goes by Kate Pryde, with Emma kind of nudging her to get the X-Men to stop calling her Kitty. But once again, this is like one of those things for Shaw which he knew was coming, but he didn't know exactly how Emma was going to play it, because like I mentioned before, Shaw had in mind his own person that he wanted to put in that chair. Like he had in mind his own person to be the Red King prior to Kitty Pryde taking that spot. And I think at one point Emma thought that Shaw wanted to put Madeline Pryor back in that seat by indirectly throwing jabs, talking about Shaw just wanted to put some eye candy in that spot. But as it turns out, when we find out who he actually wanted in that slot, when that person was actually brought back, it was pretty crazy because he killed them prior to this. And that person to whom he had plans for being the Red King, it was none other than his son, Shinobi Shaw. And the reason why this is super crazy is because, like, just a little bit of history on him. Because with Shinobi, who at a young age was abandoned by his father, to whom he later on attempted to assassinate, which Shinobi believed that he was successful at doing for some time. Because for Shinobi, when he had joined the Upstarts, which was like this group by Game Master, who was supposedly supposed to grow and be this end-all be-all organization, which needless to say didn't quite pan out that way. But essentially, with him vying to kill his father and take his power, this didn't necessarily work out, with him eventually realizing that his father was still alive. But even though for a while he did obtain some of his father's inheritance, he essentially had to let it go and go into hiding in fear that his father would come back and take him out, which was essentially what happened during the course of House of M. Because Shinobi Shaw was one of the 198 mutants who still had their powers after Scarlet Witch had nearly cleared everybody else out. And we later find out that during this time, this is when Shinobi was killed by Sebastian Shaw. And so now fast forward to Necrosha, where he was resurrected by Selene and Eli Bard. It was then that he rejoined the Upstarts, but not long after he discovered that everything he was doing from this resurrection forward, that he actually had been working for the Hellfire Club all along. And when he found that out, he took his own life. And fast forward from that, it brings us here, which is why it seems pretty crazy, at least to me. But one of the points that Sebastian Shaw makes with bringing his son here and initially wanting him to be the Red King is that he figures, well, okay, if Apocalypse and Professor X can shake hands, then why can't they work together as well? But this is one of those things even still where I believe that Shinobi has a lot of his memories missing, or at least very significant parts, because Sebastian straight up lies to him about who actually killed him. But that'll do it for this one, guys. We got a lot more to get into, and Dawn of X is just starting so heavy, and even the new stories just bringing back a lot of history. But let me know you guys' thoughts down below, and we'll do it again in the next one. Alright, later.